There are names that echo through the endless centuries of the Imperium. Names spoken only in whispers, their syllables heavy with reverence and fear. But none carry the weight of Horus Lupercal. He was the brightest son of the Emperor, the War Master who united humanity beneath the banners of the Great Crusade, and yet he became the architect of its greatest ruin. His fall was not a sudden collapse, but a slow unraveling, a symphony of pride, betrayal, and grief that tore reality itself apart. In the age before the heresy, when the galaxy still burned with the light of conquest, Horus was a figure of impossible charisma. He walked among gods and made them brothers. He commanded armies that stretched across the stars, and worlds bent their knees at the mention of his name. He did not rule through fear, but through loyalty, the kind of loyalty that makes men follow you even into the void. But what happens when the one you would die for turns against the very sun that gave him light? What happens when the golden hand of the Emperor reaches too far, and even perfection begins to doubt its purpose? In that fracture between devotion and disillusion lies the tragedy of Horus Lupercal. This is not just the story of rebellion. It is the story of faith tested beyond endurance, the story of a son who loved his father so deeply that his betrayal became the wound from which an empire still bleeds 10,000 years later. Before his name was cursed, before the legions were broken, before the galaxy burned, there was only Horus, and the shadow that waited for him. If you walk with us through the ashes of the War Master's rise, tread carefully, and for every truth revealed here was bought with blood and memory. If you believe these lost histories should not fade, lend your strength to the chronicle. Let your light mark this record. Let your voice be counted among those who remember. Subscribe your vigilance, share this remembrance, and together, we will keep the fire of knowledge burning, even in the heart of the darkest war humanity ever knew. Before the galaxy knew war on a scale that scarred eternity, before the Emperor's dream became a tomb of gold, there was the silence of creation. In that silence, the Emperor shaped his sons, 20 Primarchs, each an echo of his own divinity, each a vessel of purpose. They were not born as men are born, but as the embodiment of ideals. Horus was the first, the prototype, the most beloved. From the moment his form took shape within the secret vaults beneath the Himalayan ranges, it was said that even the Emperor paused in contemplation. Horus's essence shone brightest among them, courage tempered by intellect, compassion sharpened by ambition. If any could have stood beside the Emperor as an equal, it was him. But perfection is never left untouched. Before the suns could rise, they were stolen, scattered across the stars by the unseen hands of chaos. The warp reached into the laboratories of Terra, its tendrils coiling around each Primarch's gestation chamber, casting them into the void like fallen stars. The Emperor's greatest works were lost, and for a time, even he could not pierce the veil to retrieve them. Horus's capsule landed upon the desolate world of Chthoniya, a planet mined to its bones, its surface fractured by centuries of exploitation. Beneath its crust sprawled endless tunnels and cities of decay, ruled by gangs who survived by cunning and violence. It was here that Horus grew, not among scholars or warriors, but among the desperate and the broken. Yet the boy who would one day lead armies of millions did not rise through brutality alone. He united. He bound the warring factions through charisma, intellect, and an instinctive understanding of leadership. Even as a child, he could make men die for him not through fear, but devotion. When the Emperor finally found him, the meeting was not of strangers, but of destiny fulfilled. It was said that when their eyes met, recognition passed between them, father and son, creator and reflection. No words were needed. The Emperor, who had walked through centuries alone, finally smiled. The Great Crusade began in earnest that day. Horus became his father's companion and confidant, the only one permitted to speak without restraint in the Emperor's presence. Together they brought light to worlds that had forgotten the warmth of the sun. Horus learned the language of diplomacy and conquest, of mercy and annihilation. The Emperor taught him not only the art of war, but the art of empire, how to rule, how to inspire, how to command the loyalty of worlds. The crusade expanded like fire through dry grass. Horus's brilliance shone across the stars. He was the example by which all other Primarchs were measured, the perfect general, the perfect son. When they spoke of his victories, it was not in numbers but in reverence. He turned entire civilizations without shedding blood. brought rebellious systems to heal through charisma alone. His Luna-wolves of the Vith Legion followed him as if he were a god made flesh, and perhaps in a way he was. But where light burns brightest, shadow always follows. Among the other Primarchs, admiration turned quietly into resentment. Some, like Leman Russ, saw Horus as too diplomatic, too willing to speak where others would strike. Others, like Perturabo and Angron, envied his favor, whispering that the Emperor loved Horus not as a commander, but as a successor. Yet Horus paid them no mind. To him, the Emperor's dream was absolute. His father's word was law and his faith unshakable. It is easy to love perfection when it is never tested. It is easy to believe in destiny when one's path is clear. For years, Horus led without doubt or hesitation. But destiny in the grim machinery of the galaxy is not a gift. It is a trap. The worlds conquered during the Great Crusade were not unified by shared belief. Many submitted out of fear or necessity. Behind the parades and banners, the Imperium's expansion left trails of ruin. Some whispered that the Emperor's enlightenment was simply another form of tyranny, a uniformity imposed by divine decree. Horus heard these voices, dismissed them, but somewhere deep within, the seeds of disquiet began to take root. For every world brought into compliance, another bled. For every city illuminated by imperial truth, another was burned for heresy. Horus justified it as necessity, the price of progress. But even as he spoke those words to his men, he wondered if the Emperor's perfection allowed for compassion. When the Crusade reached Ulanor, and the Orc empires were annihilated in one of the greatest victories of mankind's history, the Emperor stood before his sons and declared a new age. In that moment, as banners rose and armies roared their devotion, he named Horus War Master, supreme commander of all the Imperium's forces. The galaxy thundered in approval. The Primarchs knelt, and Horus, for the first time in his immortal life, felt the weight of destiny press upon his shoulders. The Emperor embraced him before all others. "Lead them well," he said. "You are my chosen hand." The words were meant as blessing, but they were also a chain. As the cheers faded into the cold air of Ulanor's battlefields, Horus looked toward his father's golden armor and felt something that had never before touched his heart. Fear. Fear not of defeat but of failure, and beneath that fear, something quieter. The faint, unspoken question that would one day consume him. Was he chosen for greatness? Or to bear the burden of his father's absence? The Great Crusade was far from over, but for Horus Lupercal, the age of glory had already begun to darken. The day Horus became War Master, the Emperor's light seemed to dim just slightly, though no one dared to speak of it. Even among the Primarchs there was awe and unease. To be the Emperor's chosen was to stand above demigods, to command the legions of every world, to bear the weight of the Imperium's destiny upon a single mind. Horus accepted it with humility, or so it appeared. Yet behind the measured grace and loyalty in his eyes, 1,000 thoughts began to stir, questions that had no answer, and doubts that only the gods could hear. When the Emperor withdrew to Terra soon after, leaving the War Master to lead the crusade in his stead, Horus felt a silence he had never known. The galaxy, once bright with his father's presence, now seemed vast and cold. For the first time, Horus commanded without guidance. For the first time, his father's voice was an echo. The Emperor spoke of grand plans, of works upon Terra that would secure the future of mankind forever. But he did not explain. He did not confide. To Horus, who had stood beside him since the first stars of the crusade burned, this absence felt like exile. The Luna Wolves continued to triumph, but victory without the Emperor tasted like ash. Horus fought harder, conquered faster, hoping that achievement might bridge the distance between them. Yet the more he proved himself, the more isolated he became. The Primarchs grew restless, divided by ambition and pride. Some, like Rogaldorn and Guilliman, offered their loyalty openly. Others whispered in shadows, Fulgrim with his silvered words, Perturabo with his envy, Angron with his rage, and beneath them all, unseen, Lorgar and Erebus of the Word-Bearers watched with patient devotion, their eyes fixed on the War Master. They saw in Horus not a rival but a vessel, the perfect instrument for the god's will. It began quietly. Erebus visited the Luna Wolves under the pretense of brotherhood, offering gifts, wisdom, and spiritual counsel. He spoke of belief, of purpose, of truths the emperor denied. Horus, still loyal, dismissed the talk of gods as foolishness, and the emperor had forbidden such superstition. But Erebus's words lingered, subtle as whispers in the warp. "All sons must learn their father's limits," he said once, bowing low. "Even the greatest." At first, Horus laughed. Later, he wondered what the priest had meant. The fracture widened not in battle, but in trust. Horus began to sense that his father's grand design might not include him. Rumors spread among the legions that the emperor's work on Terra was not science, but divinity. That he meant to abandon his sons once their usefulness had ended. Horus denied it publicly. Privately, the thought haunted him. On the world of Rylys, he saw an entire population burned alive for refusing to accept imperial truth. The order had come from Terra, carried in the name of the emperor. Horus obeyed, but as he watched the skies blacken with smoke, he felt something twist within him. Was this enlightenment or tyranny? Was the dream of unity worth the death of countless innocents? He buried the question beneath duty as soldiers do, yet it returned each night sharper than before. Among his captains, murmurs of discontent grew louder. The legions were weary of endless compliance wars, the same battles fought on different worlds against different faces, all in service to an emperor who no longer walked among them. The dream had begun to rust, and into that silence stepped the word-bearers once again, their priests whispering that perhaps Horus was destined for more than obedience. When the fleet made orbit over Davin, everything changed. The world was a swamp-ridden husk, claimed long ago for the Imperium and abandoned. But Erebus urged Horus to reclaim it, claiming heresy had taken root there. The War Master, bound by duty, agreed. It was on Davin's poisoned soil that his destiny was rewritten. The battle was swift but strange. The enemy, former Imperial officers turned cultists, fought with unnatural fervor. Their weapons were crude, but their faith unshakable. During the assault, Horus led from the front as he always had. It was there, beneath the green-black skies of Davin, that he was struck by a cursed blade, a weapon not of metal but of the warp itself. Its cut was small, but its corruption infinite. He fell, and for the first time in his life, Horus Lupercal, the War Master, the brightest son of the Emperor, was powerless. His body failed him, and worse, his spirit began to drift. The medici of the Luna Wolves could not heal him. Apothecaries wept in frustration. Even the Emperor's name, spoken in desperate prayer, brought no salvation. Erebus came then, cloaked in reverence, offering one final hope. There was a temple nearby, he said, where ancient powers could restore life if Horus would only consent. The loyal captains hesitated, but in the absence of the Emperor's voice, in the face of despair, the War Master was carried into that temple of darkness. What happened within would echo through eternity. For 40 days the galaxy held its breath. The greatest warrior of mankind lay dying, and in the fevered dreams between life and death something began to speak to him. It did not call itself a god, but it knew his name. It whispered not hatred but love, not rebellion but truth. It showed him visions of a future where the Emperor became what he had always denied, a god upon a throne, ruling mankind through worship and fear. And in those visions Horus saw his brothers broken, their legions enslaved, their dreams forgotten. When Horus awoke, the wound upon his flesh had closed. But another deeper wound, unseen and eternal, had opened within his soul. He smiled, but the smile no longer reached his eyes. And though the Emperor still ruled from Terra, the galaxy had already begun to turn toward ruin. The man who emerged from the temple on Davin was not the one who entered. To his legion, Horus appeared healed, radiant even, his wounds closed, his strength returned, his eyes burning with resolve. But to those who had known him before, there was a difference too subtle to name and too profound to ignore. His voice carried the same authority, yet it felt colder now, touched by something infinite. His charisma, once warm, had sharpened into conviction. He no longer spoke of the Emperor's dream. He spoke of mankind's destiny. And in that shift, the stars themselves seemed to darken. The whispers that followed him were filled with awe. To the Luna Wolves, their War Master had faced death and triumphed. To the wider Imperium, his legend only grew. Even the other Primarchs, some envious, some loyal, could not deny that Horus's name had become myth. He was no longer merely the Emperor's chosen. He was the beating heart of the Great Crusade. But beneath the banners and ceremonies, the infection spread quietly. The wound of Davin was no longer in his flesh, but in his faith. On board the Vengeful Spirit, his flagship, the mood had changed. Chaplains whispered new litanies, warriors carried strange tokens, and the symbol of the Luna Wolves, the proud wolf's head, began to disappear from armor and standards. In its place, a new emblem emerged, the Eye of Horus, a burning golden iris upon a field of black. When his legion adopted the name Sons of Horus, it was done not out of rebellion but love. Yet love, once corrupted, becomes its own kind of blasphemy. Horus did not see himself as a heretic. He believed utterly that he was saving the Imperium from a betrayal yet to come. The visions shown to him within the temple still burned behind his eyes. He had seen the Emperor enthroned as a god, feeding upon the souls of men chained by his own ambition. The voice that had shown him this, a voice older than time, patient and kind, convinced him that the Emperor's so-called divinity was not enlightenment, but imprisonment. Humanity, it whispered, was meant to be free, and only Horus could deliver it. At first he resisted the idea. He loved his father still, loved him more than reason allowed, but the Emperor's absence, his silence from Terra, made the lies easier to believe. Days turned to weeks and the doubts became doctrine. Erebus and his allies in the Word-Bearers fanned those embers into flame, visiting Horus under the guise of counsel, feeding him fragments of heresy disguised as reason. They spoke of the primordial truth, of powers that predated the Emperor, of the gods who had shaped the warp long before humanity ever dared to dream of empire. The War Master listened. He told himself it was strategy, that understanding one's enemies was wisdom. But the truth was simpler. He was already listening to the voices that had chosen him. When the Emperor's envoys came, Malkador's agents and the custodians who carried the sigil of Terra, they found Horus changed. He received them with politeness, but behind his smile his contempt showed. He questioned orders that once he would have obeyed without hesitation. "Why does my father remain hidden?" he asked one emissary. "Why does he speak to me through messengers like a stranger?" There was no answer that could satisfy him. The fracture widened further when word reached him of Guilliman's ambition on the eastern fringe, of the Imperium Secundus, a theoretical second empire to safeguard mankind should Terra fall. To Horus it was betrayal made manifest. "While I bleed for the dream," he said to his captains, "my brothers carve their own thrones." The words spread through the legion like wildfire. The loyalty that had once bound them to the Emperor now bound them to him alone. It was then that he gathered his closest brothers, Fulgrim, Angron, Mortarion, and the ever-faithful Lorgar. On the surface of the war-torn moon of 6319, they met in secret, under the guise of a tactical conference. What transpired there changed the fate of the Imperium forever. Fulgrim, ever the aesthete, had already begun to whisper of perfection beyond mortal comprehension. Angron, consumed by rage, needed little convincing. His hatred for the Emperor's restraint burned hot and eternal. Mortarion's bitterness was older still, festering since the day the Emperor took command of his legion. And Lorgar, once punished for worship, now found divine vindication. Together they formed a pact of brotherhood that was no longer bound by loyalty to Terra, but to one another. The decision was not made with rage or passion, but calm precision. Horus would not destroy the Imperium. He would take it. He would correct his father's errors, purge the hypocrisy of false enlightenment, and remake humanity as it was meant to be. He saw not rebellion, but redemption. The first test of loyalty came soon after. On the world of Istvan III, the War Master ordered a compliance campaign, but his true intent was far darker. Under the pretext of suppressing rebellion, he sent down all those legions and officers whose loyalty to the Emperor was beyond question. Then he gave the order to cleanse the surface from orbit. For the first time, Horus turned his guns upon his own sons. The bombardment began without warning. Loyalist Astartes, who had fought beside him for centuries, looked skyward as fire rained from the heavens. Entire companies were erased in seconds, their armor vaporized, their oaths to the Emperor fulfilled only in death. The surface of Istvan III burned like a funeral pyre, not for victory but for faith. From the bridge of the Vengeful Spirit, Horus watched in silence. Some say he wept. Others say he smiled. It no longer mattered which was true. The galaxy had begun to burn, and no god, and not even the Emperor, could stop it now. The fire that consumed Istvan III was not merely the death of loyal warriors. It was the death of innocence itself. For the first time in all the centuries of conquest, the sons of the Emperor turned their weapons upon one another. The bombardment reduced cities to molten glass, erased continents, and buried millions of loyal souls beneath oceans of flame. Yet even amidst that apocalypse there were survivors, remnants of the Luna Wolves, the Emperor's children, the World Eaters, and the Death Guard who had been betrayed by their own kin. They clawed their way through ruins and ash, refusing to die quietly. They had fought for the dream of unity, and that dream was now a nightmare. For Horus, the massacre was a necessary sin. He told himself that mercy was cruelty when it prolonged delusion. He had given his brothers and his men a choice, to follow him into freedom, or perish clinging to the false light of Terra. As orbital bombardments turned into targeted strikes, the surviving loyalists rallied in the ruins of Coral City, broadcasting desperate distress calls into the void. Their pleas reached the heavens, and Horus, upon the bridge of the vengeful spirit, listened to every word. Some begged for understanding. Some cursed his name. One, Captain Garviel Loken of the Luna Wolves, spoke simply, "You were our father too." Those words pierced deeper than any blade, but Horus did not answer. His heart, once a compass guided by loyalty, had become a weapon turned against itself. When the orbital assault failed to silence the survivors, Horus sent his sons to finish what the fire had begun. The ground campaign became a slaughter. The loyalists fought with impossible courage, holding ruins and tunnels for days, killing brothers they had once sworn to protect. Apothecaries wept as they euthanized their wounded, knowing no rescue would come. Vox channels filled with static prayers, curses, and the final vows of dying men. It was a battle without glory, without honor, only tragedy. Among the traitors, unease began to grow. Some saw in the flames not liberation but damnation. But the War Master's will was absolute. His presence on the field, his voice over the Vox, turned hesitation into obedience. His charisma, twisted though it had become, still commanded reverence. Even those who doubted him obeyed, unable to resist the gravity of his conviction. When the last stronghold fell and silence reclaimed the ruins, the surface of Istvan III was little more than blackened stone. Horus gave the order to withdraw. The loyal dead were left where they lay, not buried, not mourned. Their ashes became the soil of his new empire. News of the massacre spread like wildfire through the legions. Some recoiled in horror, others in awe. Those who remained undecided now understood the truth. There was no going back. The Great Crusade had ended. The heresy had begun. On the world of Istvan V, the next act of betrayal was already being written. The War Master's forces gathered, his own sons of Horus, Fulgrim's Emperor's children, Angren's World Eaters, and Mortarian's Death Guard, arrayed in preparation for a confrontation that would cement his rebellion in blood. The Loyalist legions, the Iron Hands, Salamanders, and Raven Guard, came to stop him. They believed the War Master could still be reasoned with. They believed they were fighting a man. They were wrong. When the signal was given and the Loyalists advanced, the trap closed. At Horus's command, the reserves, the Night Lords, Word-bearers, Iron Warriors, and Alpha Legion turned their guns upon their allies. The betrayal was total. Entire companies were obliterated in moments, their formations torn apart by artillery and orbital bombardments. The skies themselves seemed to bleed. The dropsite massacre of Istvan V became legend, the first true slaughter of the Horus heresy. For hours, the loyal Primarchs fought amidst carnage beyond imagination. Ferrus Manus, his armor cracked and blade broken, faced Fulgrim in single combat. They had once been brothers. They had once laughed together beneath the stars. Fulgrim's sword fell in silence, and Ferrus's head was severed from his shoulders. Elsewhere, Vulcan and Corvus Corax fought through endless waves of corrupted Astartes, their legions shattered beyond recognition. From orbit, Horus watched the ruin unfold. His expression was unreadable. To some, he seemed triumphant, the architect of destiny finally breaking the old world. To others, he appeared haunted, as though glimpsing the abyss his choices had opened. But if doubt lingered, it was buried beneath the enormity of his purpose. The Emperor had built an empire of obedience. Horus would build one of will. As the last loyalist ships fled the system, carrying the wounded remnants of the Raven Guard and Salamanders, the galaxy trembled. Entire sectors declared for Horus. The Mechanicum split in civil war. Titans marched against Titans, Forge worlds burned, and void fleets turned their guns upon each other in cataclysmic fury. The warp, long held at bay by the Emperor's presence, began to stir. Across the stars, demonic phenomena flared like sparks in dry tinder. And through it all, the name of Horus was spoken not as a title, but as a god's. The War Master had become the new axis upon which mankind's fate revolved. Yet in the quiet moments aboard the vengeful spirit, when no one else could see, Horus stood alone before the viewing ports, staring into the void. The stars burned coldly in their distant fury, indifferent to the blood that drenched them. He had conquered fear, conquered faith, conquered loyalty itself. But somewhere deep within, a voice, when faint, almost forgotten, still whispered his father's name. He silenced it. The age of the Emperor was over. The age of the War Master had begun. There are many ways a soul can die before its body does. For Horus Lupercal, the process was not sudden but patient, an unraveling of certainty thread by thread, until even the idea of redemption became impossible. By the time the smoke cleared from Istvan, the War Master was no longer a man bound by love or loyalty. He had become a vessel, not of chaos as mortals would later name it, but of conviction so absolute it devoured all reason. He believed he had seen truth. He believed he had been chosen not to destroy his father, but to save humanity from him. That belief, more than any demonic promise, was what damned him. Aboard the vengeful spirit, the air hummed with the invisible pulse of the warp. The ship had begun to change, though few dared to acknowledge it. Corridors that had once glowed with sterile light now flickered with something organic. Faint movement seen in reflection, whispers in the vents, symbols appearing on bulkheads and vanishing when touched. Tech priests from the Mechanicum muttered about material bleed, the corruption of reality itself, but their augurs failed to register what their eyes could plainly see. The vengeful spirit was becoming a shrine, though its god still wore the face of a man. In his private sanctum, Horus spent hours in solitude, studying the sigils Erebus had left for him, the serpentine symbols of the primordial truth. He traced them across his armor, not as a mark of worship, but of power. Each line, each curve felt familiar, as though written into his very being. He no longer saw them as alien or heretical. To him, they were destiny made visible. It was Lorgar who visited him first, bringing with him the dark scriptures of the word-bearers, the sermons that had cost him his father's trust decades earlier. Lorgar spoke softly, reverently, as if addressing both a brother and a prophet. "You have seen what I was punished for believing," he said. The Emperor's truth was a lie. He would be a god, yet denies the name. Horus said nothing, but the silence between them was not denial. It was consent unspoken. The change rippled outward. The legions that followed him began to transform, their faith now untethered from the imperial truth. Where once the Astartes had been symbols of discipline and order, now they became something else, avatars of belief. Chaplains began replacing the imperial aquila with new sigils. Warriors began chanting prayers not to the Emperor but to the War Master himself. And across the fleet, the phrase Lupercal Rex, Horus is king, began to echo through vox channels and corridors. The corruption was never overt. It was ritual, discipline, unity. The same virtues that had once bound the Imperium now turned inward, serving a single man. To the sons of Horus, it did not feel like rebellion. It felt like revelation. The first to fully understand what was happening was Malagurst, Horus's equerry. Once his most trusted friend, he began to sense the depth of the transformation. He saw how Erebus's priests spoke in private with Horus, how their words had replaced counsel, how their rituals left faint burns in the air. When he confronted Horus cautiously with love, the War Master smiled and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You think I am deceived," he said softly. "But I am more awake now than I have ever been." Malaghurst bowed, unable to reply. He realized then that loyalty and fear had become the same thing. The Serpent's Lodge on Davin had been the beginning, but the true corruption came later when Horus began to dream. Night after night visions came, not as nightmares but as clarity. He saw his father seated upon a throne of gold, his body lifeless, his will stretched across the galaxy like a web. He saw the Primarchs reduced to servitors of faith, their legions turned into temples. He saw himself kneeling before that throne, his name erased, his purpose hollow. The visions were lies, yet they struck the deepest chords of truth within him. For was it not the Emperor who forbade worship, even as men began to worship him? Was it not the Emperor who hid his purpose on Terra, shrouding his sons in ignorance while demanding their devotion? Horus's faith twisted beneath the weight of such contradictions. He could not accept that his father might be right. It was easier, more righteous, and to believe that he was being betrayed. And so his conviction hardened. To those who questioned him, he spoke with the eloquence of a prophet. My father would chain mankind to his own perfection, he said. I would free it. It was a lie dressed in nobility, the most dangerous kind. His words spread faster than fleets. Entire systems defected without battle, declaring allegiance to the War Master's truth. But in the warp, the gods who had whispered to him stirred and laughed, for they knew what even Horus did not, that no mortal, no Primarch, could wield belief without being consumed by it. The first demons began to appear, though none called them that. They came as visions, as advisors, as reflections in the mirror, figures who spoke softly of power, of destiny, of love. They told Horus that he had surpassed his father, that even the Emperor now feared him. And though he denied them, a part of him believed it. He began to feel it. The power that came when he spoke, the way the air itself seemed to tremble when he willed it. He told himself it was charisma. But it was the warp, feeding upon him, shaping him into the very weapon it had designed. The serpent did not strike. It whispered and Horus listened. And so the War Master, once the Emperor's light, began his descent into the abyss, not through hatred, but through faith. The corruption of Horus was not marked by fire or conquest, but by stillness, a quiet metamorphosis that crept beneath the banners of his fleets and the prayers of his sons. The War Master began to speak less of strategy and more of faith. In the war councils aboard the Vengeful Spirit, maps of conquered sectors were replaced by visions of a new Imperium, one free from the hypocrisy of Terra, one where gods were not denied, but embraced. Those who listened to him no longer felt like soldiers of the Emperor. They felt like disciples of destiny. The transformation of the legion spread like a contagion of belief. Fulgrim's Emperor's children turned their pursuit of perfection inward until it became obsession. Their senses stretched beyond sanity. Angren's World Eaters abandoned even the pretense of discipline, their butcher's nails thrumming with unnatural rhythm, each pulse echoing the heartbeat of the warp. Mortarian's Death Guard grew pale and silent, their armor corroding with strange living filth. And Lorgar, the first to kneel before the gods, preached that Horus was not merely their chosen general, but their anointed son. In these early days of the heresy, the line between loyalty and worship dissolved entirely. To follow Horus was to believe in him. To doubt him was treason. The War Master himself walked among his men with a serenity that masked torment. In private, he began to experience visions too vivid to ignore. When he closed his eyes, he saw worlds burning in lightless flame, his father's corpse entombed upon a throne of gold, and his own reflection crowned in stars and ruin. He told himself these were prophecies of what must be, sacrifices made for the salvation of mankind. But even he could not always tell where his will ended and the will of the gods began. The demonic emissaries grew bolder. They no longer whispered from shadows. They appeared in plain sight. In the strategy chambers of the Vengeful Spirit, in the flicker of hololithic light, they manifested as silhouettes cloaked in shadow and laughter. Some took the shapes of the dead, old comrades, fallen Primarchs, even facsimiles of the Emperor himself. Horus did not recoil from them. He listened, he argued. He reasoned with the impossible, convinced that he was master of the forces that sought to consume him. But control is the first illusion chaos bestows. One night, if such a word still meant anything in the void, Horus stood alone before the great viewing port, the stars wheeling endlessly beyond. He spoke aloud to the silence. I will not serve, he said. I will rule. The reflection that answered him smiled, though Horus himself did not. Across the galaxy, loyal worlds burned. The War Master's fleet swept from system to system, gathering strength, bending mortals and Astartes alike beneath his cause. Forge worlds declared for him, promising legions of new war machines. Rogue trader dynasties sent tribute, eager to survive the coming age. The warp churned with storms so vast that navigation itself faltered. The Astronomican flickered, dimmed by the corruption spreading through reality. And through it all, the Imperial response lagged behind. On Terra, the Emperor remained silent, locked within his hidden chambers. Malkador ruled in his stead, dispatching loyal Primarchs to rally what forces remained. But distance and disbelief were Horus's greatest allies. Few could imagine that the War Master, the Emperor's most beloved son, had truly fallen. For those who still doubted, Horus's legions made believers of them in fire and ruin. The massacre at Istvan had been only the beginning. The assault on the loyalist strongholds continued. Planets scoured, loyal garrisons annihilated, entire fleets defecting in terror or surrender. Each victory fed the myth of Horus as the new master of mankind. He began to call himself not War Master, but Liberator of Humanity. His speeches were recorded and transmitted across the stars, proclamations that the Emperor had abandoned his people, that the so-called Golden Throne was a tomb for ambition. "I will finish what he began," Horus declared, his voice echoing through 1,000 worlds. "I will bring man to godhood not as slaves, but as kings." The warp itself seemed to answer him. Storms flared, but within their maelstroms his fleets passed untouched. Demons knelt in reverence when his name was spoken. He had become what he once despised, a god in all but name, and yet, in the quiet hours when the fleet slept and the warp grew still, he would remember Chthoniya, the tunnels where he had first learned to lead, the laughter of men who had followed him because they believed, not because they feared. Those memories came less often now. When they did, they brought no comfort, only the faint taste of what he had traded for eternity. The serpent's whisper had become his heartbeat. And soon even his brothers, now, the few who still loved him, would be forced to choose between blood and belief. In the next act, the galaxy itself would fracture, and the light of Terra would be tested against the fury of its fallen sun. The fire began at the edges of the Imperium, faint at first, like sparks flickering against the dark, then spreading into storms that no hand could contain. Horus's rebellion had become a wildfire consuming everything the Emperor had built. Entire sectors turned against Terra. Astropaths screamed in unison as warp storms severed the galaxy into isolated islands of terror. The dream of unity, once the Emperor's greatest triumph, fractured into madness. In the void above the ruined worlds of the Istvan system, the fleets of Horus gathered in silence. Thousands of warships painted in fresh sigils, their hulls inscribed with oaths to the New Age. The sons of Horus, the Emperor's children, the Death Guard, and the World Eaters moved as one living machine, their ranks swollen by demonic entities masquerading as men. At the heart of it all loomed the vengeful spirit, a cathedral of war now alive with the pulse of the warp. Every corridor breathed. Every shadow whispered. Horus walked its halls like a god inspecting creation. Where once he had demanded discipline, he now accepted worship. His warriors knelt in his presence, chanting the war song of their rebirth. The War Master is the truth, the War Master is freedom. He did not correct them. The man who had once sworn never to be worshipped now listened in silence, and the silence was consent. His strategy was flawless. He struck first not at Terra but at its arteries. Loyalist supply lines vanished, cut by unseen fleets. Titan legions defected to his banner. The mechanicum of Mars, torn between loyalty and power, imploded into civil war. Entire forge worlds turned black as their surface lit with volcanic fire. Loyal magi purged by those who had sworn to the dark mechanicum. Great foundries that had once armed the Imperium now beat for Horus. On the battlefield, the change was undeniable. Where Imperial armies once fought with doctrine and discipline, the traitor legions fought with hunger, with frenzy, with belief. The eye of Horus blazed upon their armor like a sun of damnation. The War Master himself appeared where the fighting was thickest, teleporting amidst collapsing citadels, his presence alone enough to bend the will of armies. Those who saw him swore that his armor shimmered with light not of the physical world, golden and black, shifting, alive. When loyalists looked upon him, they saw not the brother they once knew, but something greater and far more terrible. The Imperium's response was slow, fragmented. The Emperor still did not speak, and the burden fell to the loyalist Primarchs, Rogel Dorn, Sanguinius Guilliman, and the scattered remnants of their brothers. They fought not merely against armies, but against disbelief. Each world that fell carried with it a weight of confusion. How could the War Master, the greatest of all, have turned? Was it madness? Was it corruption? Or was it truth unspoken? In that confusion, Horus found his greatest weapon. He sent envoys, what not soldiers but words. Vox transmissions broadcast across conquered sectors, his voice carried like scripture. Your emperor would see you die for his stagnation. I would see you live as gods. To countless systems weary of war, his words sounded like salvation. They called him the Liberator. Those who refused found only fire. Among the traitor legions, the transformation was complete. Fulgrim, lost to the siren call of perfection, spoke to reflections no one else could see. Angren became the living embodiment of rage, his warriors more demon than man. Mortarian's death guard, now rotting from within, marched through plague and decay, their armor fused to their flesh. And Lorgar, prophet of faith perverted, crowned Horus as Lord of the Galaxy in a ceremony lit by burning slaves and demon fire. The galaxy became a theater of nightmares. On Macragge, Guilliman fortified the eastern fringe. On Baal, Sanguinius prayed beneath the black sun. On Terra, Rogel Dorn built walls higher than hope itself. But Horus was no longer bound by walls. His fleets moved through the warp like knives through flesh, guided by the gods he still refused to name. The warp storms themselves seemed to open before him, a red sea parting for its chosen. And yet, for all his victories, the War Master felt the first tremors of unease. His brothers, those who followed him, had changed too much. They no longer spoke to him as equals. Some knelt when he entered. Others no longer recognized his authority at all. Angren obeyed only when blood was promised. Fulgrim spoke in riddles and laughter, his eyes reflecting things not of this world. Even Lorgar, the most devout, began to speak of Horus not as man, but as prophet, a vessel through which the gods acted. That word, vessel, haunted him. In moments of solitude, when the laughter of demons faded, Horus wondered if he still commanded his own destiny. He would tell himself yes, that he was the master, not the pawn, that the gods served him, not the other way around. But even as he thought it, the walls of the vengeful spirit pulsed with quiet amusement. The war spread without pause. The Imperium's outer systems collapsed into anarchy, their astropaths blinded by storms. Fleets vanished into the warp, never to return. Loyal worlds turned traitor overnight. The light of the Astronomican flickered. And for the first time since the dawn of the Great Crusade, the Emperor's vision faltered. From the darkened bridge of his ship, Horus looked toward the distant beacon of Terra, faint, defiant and waiting. He whispered almost tenderly, "Father, I'm coming home." The road to Terra was paved with ruin. Horus's fleets moved like a storm front across the void, unstoppable, methodical, almost beautiful in their devastation. Every world between the War Master and the cradle of mankind became a monument to choice, submission or extinction. Those who knelt were spared, reborn under his banner. Those who resisted were erased. His fleets did not linger. They did not conquer for resources or plunder. They burned to purify, to prepare the galaxy for its new order. Each conquered world added to the legend. Horus was no longer spoken of as a traitor among the systems that followed him, but as the reclaimer. Priests of the word-bearers preached that he was mankind's true savior, the son who had refused to let his father's empire die in silence. And as the gods had intended, belief became the fuel for his power. In orbit above the planet Moloch, the next stage of his ascension began. There, the veil between the Imperium and the warp was thin, a place the Emperor himself had once visited in secret, long before the Great Crusade. Horus knew this. He sought not just to destroy, but to understand what his father had hidden. The battle for Moloch raged for weeks, a contest between faith and fury. When Horus finally descended into the ancient ruins beneath its surface, he found the remnants of a gateway, a wound in reality itself, faintly pulsing with the echoes of divine power. The moment he stepped within, the universe changed. What happened there has never been fully recorded, though some claim that Horus walked into the warp and was reborn by its lords. Others whisper that he reached out to the same power that had created the Emperor and demanded equality. What is known is that when he emerged, his eyes no longer reflected the stars. They contained them. The aura that surrounded him was unbearable, even to other Primarchs. Fulgrim fell to his knees. Lorgar wept. Angren roared in both awe and fear. Horus had become more than mortal. The gods had blessed him or cursed him with the totality of their favor. He was no longer a pawn. He was a weapon forged by divinity itself. The man who had once doubted the Emperor's right to godhood had now become the closest thing to it. And yet, in that moment of transcendence, the last fragment of Horus Lupercal, the man, the son, the brother, had began to die. The power he had sought had come with a price that could never be paid. The next campaigns bore the mark of this transformation. His tactics grew crueler, his victories darker. On Dwell, the civilian population was offered a single hour to pledge loyalty before being turned to ash. On Carthage, he unleashed weapons that distorted time itself, leaving its defenders trapped in infinite seconds of agony. The War Master no longer fought to prove a point. He fought to make a statement. The message was clear. Nothing could stop him now. Meanwhile, the Imperium collapsed inward. Guilliman's Ultramarines, cut off by warp storms, fought to maintain the eastern fringe but could no longer reach Terra. The Raven Guard and Salamanders licked their wounds after Istvan. The Lion and his Dark Angels were lost in the warp's tempest. Rogel Dorn became the Emperor's wall, fortifying the palace while Sanguinius, Angel of Hope, prepared for the final confrontation he knew would come. For 10 years, the galaxy burned. Planets once bright with civilization became dead worlds. The warp bled freely into real space. Even the void began to twist, filled with echoes of laughter and screams that never ended. Humanity's empire, which had taken millennia to build, collapsed in less than a decade. And at its center stood the architect of it all, a god in the image of a man who had once believed in peace. But even gods are haunted. At times, aboard the vengeful spirit, the War Master would wake in silence, feeling something move through his memories. He would see himself as he had been, young, brilliant, filled with faith, standing beside his father as they raised banners over conquered worlds. He would remember the pride in the Emperor's voice when he said his name. Then the vision would dissolve, replaced by the faces of those he had betrayed. Horus would rise from his bed in fury, shattering furniture with a single gesture, commanding the demons in the shadows to silence the ghosts. But they never did. They only smiled. The closer he came to Terra, the more the warp thickened. The storms parted for his fleet as if the galaxy itself feared him. When the first reports came that the Sol system's outer defenses had fallen, Pluto's bastions in ruin, the Jovian moons burning, the Loyalists finally understood that this was no longer a rebellion. It was the end of an age. At last, the vengeful spirit emerged from the void beyond Saturn, its massive hull blotting out the light of the stars. Behind it came the Armada, a fleet so vast it turned the void to shadow. Horus stood upon the bridge, staring at the distant glow of Terra. He said nothing. He did not need to. Every soul aboard his ship felt it, the inevitability, the culmination of prophecy, the return of the Son to the Father. The siege of Terra had begun. Terra, cradle of humanity, throne of empire, and now the last fortress of the doomed dream called the Imperium. The sky above it burned red with the light of 1,000 ships, the void itself fractured by the clash of godlike wills. The War Master had come home and all of creation trembled. The invasion began with silence. For hours the fleets of Horus hung beyond orbit, arrayed in perfect formation, their hulls reflecting the pale light of the dying sun. Then, as if the galaxy itself drew breath, the silence broke. Warp energy flared and the bombardment began. From orbit to stratosphere, the world shuddered beneath apocalyptic fire. Mountains turned to glass. Oceans boiled. The air became smoke, and yet Terra endured. Rogel Dorn's defenses held, titanic walls of plasteel and adamantium, fortresses within fortresses, energy shields shimmering like aurorae against the falling fire. The Imperial Palace rose from the ruins like a mountain of faith, its towers piercing the clouds, its foundations sunk into the bedrock of history. Within its labyrinthine halls, millions of defenders stood ready. Imperial fists, blood angels, remnants of shattered legions, and mortal soldiers by the billions. They were not fighting for victory. They were fighting for memory. When the first landing craft broke through the void shields and slammed into the surface, The war became something beyond strategy. The ground itself screamed. Titans of both sides strode across the plains of the palace, their footsteps carving canyons into the earth. Macro cannon shells fell like meteor storms. The sky was black with drop pods and burning wreckage. The traitor legions descended like an infection, sons of Horus, world eaters, death guard, emperor's children, each one carrying a piece of the warp with them. The air warped around them, reality twisting beneath their tread. Demons manifested in the shock waves of their weapons, clawing into existence only to be obliterated by bolter fire and faith. It was not war as mankind had ever known it. It was apocalypse given form. On the walls, the loyalists fought without rest. Men who had never seen a space marine before now stood beside them, firing until their weapons melted. Blood angels filled the air with the sound of hymns, their voices rising even as their wings blackened from smoke. Imperial fists died by the thousands to hold breaches closed with their own bodies. Mechanicum thralls fought and burned beside Sisters of Silence, the null voices of humanity's last defense against the demonic tide. And through it all, the Emperor remained upon the golden throne. His mind was not idle. It was the shield of the Imperium itself, holding back the tides of unreality that sought to consume the planet. While his sons fought in flesh and blood, he fought in thought and soul, yet every moment of that battle drained him, pulling his essence thin across the immensity of the warp. Horus knew this. He wanted the Emperor to suffer, not through defeat but through recognition. He wanted his father to see what he had created. The siege was not merely war. It was judgment. The first days were slaughter. The second week was madness. The palace's outer walls fell. Titans dueled in the courtyards, their corpses forming mountains of metal and fire. Angren led the assault personally, carving a path through the Eternity Gate with axes that screamed with demonic voices. The custodes met him there, silent and unyielding. For every one that fell, 10 traitors died. Angren's laughter echoed through the carnage, the laughter of one who had long forgotten pain. Fulgrim's warriors followed, singing songs of ecstasy as they butchered civilians. The Death Guard's plague fleets bombarded the lower hives with toxins so vile they corroded the soul itself. The World Eaters tore through the Saturnine wall in rivers of gore. It was said that the rivers of Terra ran red for 40 days, and that the scent of blood reached the throne room itself. In that endless night, a single figure shone like light through storm, Sanguinius, Angel of Baal. With wings of fire and a heart untouched by corruption, he led the Blood Angels in counterattack after counterattack, turning despair into defiance. Wherever he flew, the traitors faltered. His presence alone rekindled courage, yet even he could not be everywhere, and for every victory he won, 10 more walls fell. Still, he fought on. As the siege dragged into months, Horus's fury grew. His armies were victorious, but Terra refused to die. The defiance of its defenders mocked his divinity. For all his power, for all his godlike strength, he could not break what his father had built. Each night he stood before the great windows of the vengeful spirit, staring at the world below, his reflection blurred by flame. He began to doubt again, not in his cause, but in his control. The demons whispered endlessly now. They demanded blood, demanded that he open the gates of the warp fully and consume the world whole. But Horus hesitated. He wanted victory to be his. He would not let the gods claim his triumph, and so he summoned the Emperor, not by voice but by act. He lowered the planetary shields that protected his ship, exposing himself to counterattack, an act of arrogance or perhaps of invitation. He wanted his father to come to him, to end the war not through armies, but through bloodline. The Emperor understood. Leaving the Golden Throne, leaving behind the machinery that kept the Astronomican alive, he gathered his custodians, his bodyguard, and his chosen son, Sanguinius. Together they boarded the teleport arrays that would carry them to the vengeful spirit. It was the final journey of the Emperor of mankind. The vengeful spirit awaited them like a tomb, adrift in eternity. It hung in low orbit above Terra, a fortress of living metal and corrupted light. When the Emperor and his companions materialized within its halls, the ship seemed to breathe, its corridors twisting and expanding, its shadows filled with motion. The air was thick with incense and decay. Voices whispered from the walls in languages that predated creation itself. The assault began instantly. Custodians and Imperial fists fought demons and warped Astartes through corridors that shifted like nightmares. The ship was no longer bound by mortal geometry. Its interior bent in impossible ways, forming labyrinths of bleeding steel and shrines to the gods of chaos. Every step toward the War Master was a battle of will as much as of weapon. Some of the Emperor's guard fell not to blade or bullet, but to visions, illusions of their past, of families long dead, of paradise restored if only they would turn away. But the Emperor pressed forward, radiant and silent, a being of pure psychic light cutting through the madness. Beside him strode Sanguinius, his armor broken, his wings tattered, his spirit shining like the last sunrise. They spoke no words. None were needed. At the heart of the vengeful spirit, within a chamber vast as a cathedral and ringed by symbols that pulsed with the power of the warp, Horus waited. He stood before a panoramic window that looked down upon Terra, his father's world, his cradle, his prize. His armor was no longer armor, but living flesh and gold, its surface shifting with serpentine light. When he turned, his eyes were stars and his voice carried the weight of the gods. "Father," he said, "you should have ruled as I do now, with truth." The Emperor looked at him, not as a foe, but as a son. For a moment, even amidst the ruin, there was silence between them, the kind only family can share. "You were my truth," the Emperor said softly, "and now you are my failure." It was then that Sanguinius stepped forward. He did not wait for command nor seek permission. Perhaps he knew that this was his end, that prophecy could not be defied, only fulfilled. Horus looked upon him not with hatred but with pity. "You could have stood beside me," the War Master said. "I stand for him," Sanguinius answered. The duel was brief, almost merciful. The angel struck first, his blade singing with divine fire, but Horus was beyond mortal strength. With a gesture he broke Sanguinius' blade. With another he crushed his chest. The blood angel fell silently, his wings folding around him like a shroud. And as the life faded from his eyes, something in Horus hesitated, for the first and last time. Then the Emperor spoke, his voice echoing through the ship and the warp beyond. "This ends now." The battle between father and son transcended words, transcended even time. Blades met with the force of suns colliding. Reality screamed. The warp flared and rippled, showing visions of every possible future. Worlds where Horus triumphed, where mankind was enslaved to gods, where even the stars bled. Horus fought with fury and sorrow, his blows fueled by the belief that he was saving humanity from eternal stagnation. The Emperor fought with grief deeper than any weapon could wound. To the mortals who later told the tale, it lasted moments. To those who touched the warp, it lasted forever. At last, Horus struck a mortal blow. His talon tore through the Emperor's armor, shattering it, spilling golden light and blood that was not blood. The Emperor fell to one knee. Around them, the demons howled in triumph. Horus looked down, breathing heavily, trembling. "You see now," he said, "even gods can die." And yet, as he spoke, something stirred in the Emperor's gaze, not rage, but compassion. He saw for a flicker of eternity the son he had raised, the boy who had once walked beside him on the first worlds of the crusade. And he wept. When he rose, the light that emanated from him was unbearable. The demons recoiled. The gods themselves turned away. The Emperor's voice, calm and sorrowful, filled the chamber. "I cannot save you, my son," he said. "So I will end you." The final strike was not made in anger. It was made in love. A surge of power unlike anything the galaxy had ever known erupted from the Emperor's hand, consuming Horus utterly, burning away his flesh, his soul, his essence. For a moment there was silence. The demons screamed and vanished, torn apart by the same light that had once created them. The vengeful spirit shook, its walls cracking, its structure collapsing under the force of divine grief. When it was over, there was nothing left of the War Master but dust and shadow. The man named Horus Lupercal, the brightest star of humanity, was gone. The Emperor fell beside him, his mortal shell broken beyond repair. Rogel Dorn found him there, surrounded by ruin, cradling the body of the son he had slain. With his last strength, the Emperor whispered the only order that mattered, "Take me to the throne." And so he was carried home, not as a conqueror, but as a god entombed. In the silence that followed Horus's death, the galaxy itself seemed to hold its breath. The demons were gone. The warp storms receded, and for the first time in centuries the guns fell quiet. But what remained was not peace, and it was absence. The absence of a son, the absence of a father, the absence of the dream that once bound all of mankind together beneath the same sun. The Emperor's shattered form was borne to the golden throne, where the Mechanicum's adepts, whispering in awe and terror, entombed him within the machine that would sustain his will. In that moment, the master of mankind ceased to be a man. He became the God Emperor, a corpse that ruled an empire, a light that would never again move or speak. The Astronomican burned anew, brighter than before. Yet its light was born from agony eternal. The galaxy rebuilt itself around that grief. The Imperium called the age that followed the time of rebirth. But it was not rebirth, it was survival. Worlds lay in ruin. Legions were broken. Faith replaced law, and bureaucracy replaced truth. The Emperor's dream of reason had died with Horus. In its place rose something colder and stronger, into belief. The same belief Horus had sought to destroy now became the Imperium's foundation. Humanity learned to worship the one who could no longer answer their prayers. The name Horus was stricken from every record. His statues were melted, his deeds erased, his very image forbidden. Yet his shadow could not be destroyed. It lived in the silence between stars, in the doubt within every soul who had once called him brother, in the question that could never again be asked: if the greatest of us could fall, what hope is left for the rest? And so the galaxy endured, not through triumph but through mourning. Each world became a shrine, each war a repetition of that ancient tragedy. 10,000 years later, the Emperor still sits upon his throne, neither dead nor alive, and humanity still fights the war Horus began. The Imperium he sought to save has become the nightmare he feared. In the end, Horus was right about one thing. His father did become a god, but it was Horus who made him one. And as long as mankind endures, the echo of the War Master's fall will never fade. For every empire built upon devotion carries within it the seed of betrayal, and every act of faith is haunted by the memory of the son who loved too much.